everyone. Welcome to the second release day of speakers at Mock COP. We're so excited to have you with us today.
Hello, I'm Aoife Mercedes Rodriguez. I'm another one of the staff members. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. We really hope you enjoyed yesterday's speakers. And yeah, thank you for coming along.
Hi everyone, my name is Malaika. I'm 17 and I am also an event coordinator for Mock COP in Canada. Really excited to have you here today. So before we jump into the speakers, some of the speakers that you'll be seeing today will also be appearing in a panel discussion in 2 days. So make sure that you go to pigeonhole.at/mockcop so that you can check out Mock COP's Pigeonhole where you can submit questions and then also upvote questions for all of the speakers appearing today to make sure you can get your questions answered in 2 days' time. So without further ado, should we start introducing our speakers?
Absolutely. So first off, we've got Paloma Costa, who's looking into the theme of climate justice. And so she's a young climate activist from Brasilia, basis of Brazilian government, who is finishing her studies in law and social science at the University of Brasilia, researching at the Judicial Clinic of Human Rights, Judicial Office for Ethnic and Cultural Diversity. She's advisor at Instituto Socioambiental on social environmental rights, including indigenous and traditional peoples, being responsible for bringing the youth perspective to the organization. From 2018 to 2020 in the youth-led organization Engajamundo, she coordinated the working group of climate and the youth delegations to COP24 and COP25, and UNLAC Climate Week and hashtag Amazon Center of the World, as well as co-created Clima, a climate education program, and the Brazilian Youth Demands on Climate. She's a member of Abu Dhabi's Youth Voices that went to Abu Dhabi climate meeting and supported the UN Youth Envoy's officer on the delivery of the Youth Climate Summit. She's part of several networks and co-founded hashtag Free the Future movement by Climáticos. She's personally supported Indigenous youth initiatives, awareness and meaningful participation on processes. Alongside the UN Secretary General, she participated on the opening of the Climate Action Summit and represented the NGOs on the UN Human Rights Council on the topic of youth and climate. She was recently appointed as one of the remarkable young leaders to compose the UNSG's Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change.
So now let's watch her speech.
Your Excellencies, and to all authorities here present, the ones recognized and the ones that should be recognized as part of the decision-making process. My sincere gratitude for the invitation, and more importantly, I want to thank all who have gathered here to take action in these difficult times. My name is Paloma Costa, and I am from Brazil, from Latin America. Well, I am what is left from this place, what could not be killed, where the Amazon is threatened and where human rights seems to mean nothing, where we have to be the outcome of this dominant paradigm of development, an economic model that we insist that sustain our nations, but it's not sustainable at all, where the mining and large enterprises are destroying our land and our people. Here, we are bargained as cattle, with our lives on sale, serving as a workforce for wood's consumption, and providing commodities and foods with the costs of our life. We are a health experiment, as access to health here is precarious and pesticides are deep common in our food and plantations. Not even the mercury used in mining is here recognized as a potential cause for disease. We are what is left from this empty political speech that ingrains our lives since colonization and that now shows its most horrible face, not guaranteeing our democracies, our freedom of expression, and not open for a dialogue with the emerging population movement for freedom, for life. As we come from the global south, I cannot help mentioning that we will always be the photograph of a missing person who is daily threatened by climate, violence, prejudice, and lack of responsibility. 500 years later, the colonization way of thinking, a monoculture of our minds, still carries on genocide, ecocide, and ethnocide. But now, they come disguised as economic growth, development, and good moral. Right now, there are still people being arrested, killed, and oppressed just for being social environmentalists, forest protectors, brigadistas, and activists. And I am tired of being called cancer terrorist. In this scenario, people still ask me if I'm afraid to defend our environment, since Latin America unfortunately is the champion when it comes to the killing of environmental and land defenders. Well, as I already said, what scares me the most is this massive killing unpunished and widely known. What really scares me is the current stagnation of the decision makers in order to make deep structural changes in our society. Our house is on fire, literally. So what else can we do as youth than stay asking, screaming, and chanting for action? The man's in charge keep centering their decisions in the capital, throwing their hate upon us, upon our environment, upon our agreements and institutions, while destroying what is ours by right. And the problem? The problem is the silence, where everyone can see the Amazon burning, reaching in 2020 its tipping point, with 20% of forest loss threatened to become a savanna, with 26% of the Pantanal biome left in ashes, just with this year's fire. The silence in facing the climate emergency, public denying science, public denying the reality, spreading fake news to manipulate our minds. While the situation is a world collapsing, with a triple emergency on climate, massive biodiversity loss, and the vulnerability to new diseases, impulsionated for a deep and more problematic crisis, which is the systemic crisis that questions our own humanity, our structures, and our own capacity of still being alive as a society on this earth. The climate emergency is a clear threat to human rights and human life. And all of this denial is a political project of death. And as David Attenborough said, it's not about saving our planet. It's about saving our lives. So I ask, do we want our own extinction? In face of this existential threat, my voice and other million more cannot pass unheard anymore. We screamed in the streets last year. We are demarcating the screens this year. And we will keep screaming so loud, that I can only hope that we hear ourselves. Because in the end, we are the ones we've been waiting to save ourselves. So that's why right now it is necessary that everyone rethinks and re-earth the way we are relating with our entire world, our society, our communities, taking responsibility for our acts. Because every act we do is interconnected with each other acts. Who we vote, what we choose to consume, both products or informations. Everything has an impact in this globalization society. And in the end, we are all part of this integrated social ecological system. Our Pachamama depends on us as much as we depend on her to still be alive. That's why me, who last year was misinterpreted when I said that we don't need praying, but acting for the Amazon. Now I say that right now, we need all. Really, we need a complex and complete conjuncture of really united nations into a global community where we tackle social-environmental crises without frontiers. Because if we want to win this fight as humanity and change the paths of our own history, we can only do it together in a big coalition for life. And we are a piece of land that is worth. We are thousands and thousands of histories that are worth hearing. Our people still grow while growing food on this earth. We resist by collecting and planting seeds everywhere. And the fight for our freedom is blossoming. As much as you don't see the big media noticing it, we do. We do notice each and every single change in this world. And we will remember everything. We will keep rising as the Samauma with big, big roots. And this is the traditional knowledge of our land and ancestors that we as Latin Americans have to take to the table. A knowledge that was passed to me through Davi Yanomami, a shaman from Brazil. He said to me, if we stop laughing, dancing and painting our bodies, this means that the mercantile people won. If they win, we all lose. So as our Pachamama has been resistant, united we will resist. Because through the power of memory, the land lives on, and we resist with the original people of these lands. So I want to state something once again today. Our lives are not for sale. Our land are not for sale. We cannot come with market solutions to human problems. We cannot play or bargain with our future. So I stand with my people in Latin America, insurrecting for democracy, and I invite all youths across the world to stand up too against fascism, destruction, and the lack of respect for our life. As I once heard, agreements are not made between politics, but between nations. So I want to see all nations declaring a climate emergency, because we have all the solutions to start freeing our future. We can defeat local struggles if this becomes a global fight. So what more do we need to see to start turning all the solutions available into real commitments and policies? To adopt mechanisms where people have responsibility for their actions and recommendations given really guide the parties in an inclusive, deliberative and binding way. Youth are one of the only groups taking this responsibility seriously. So why don't we just guarantee the participation of all sectors and actors when it comes to making a decision? We are drowning in our lack of action. And this is affecting the youth in different levels. We are facing anxiety and other health issues, losing schools, just because we don't see the world advancing. What will be left of us? What will be left for us? Participation is key when it comes on thinking for transitions. And to effectively participate, there are some things that need to be taken care of, such as access to information, which means accountability and transparency. The information about policies, implementations, fundings, and etc. need to be public. On the other hand, we need to guarantee education so the information available can be understood, because transparency and accountability are not only about putting some technical informations online, but that those informations are understandable in a way we all really get what they mean and what are their implications. And for least, we need inclusion. It's even a matter of judicial security. When we guarantee free, previous, and well-informed consultations with effective participation from the different impacted actors, this prevents from further litigation processes. I mean, when you don't include someone in the discussions, when you cut someone out of the photo, you are not only erasing a person, you are erasing a fight, an entire history, a knowledge, a continent. That's why most decisions made in global spaces, that mostly happen in the north area of the globe, are dissonant with what is needed in the front lines. Because we still have to fight for our space to speak, to participate. But you know, I still have hope. Really, I do. I am seeing the Forest People Alliance back again. I'm seeing youth uniting all around the world. And as Célia Chacriabá, a young indigenous woman from Brazil, said, the world is full of information, but with lack of conscience. So if this is really the COP we have this year, I will just ask, are we conscious enough to finally take action and protect our home? Reforestating our minds and imaginaries? Or we will just keep talking and conversating each and every year? We need to unite. So let's do it for ourselves. Thank you.
Wow, Paloma, that was amazing. I really loved how you described how when you cut someone out of a photo, you're not just erasing a person, but you're erasing an entire fight, an entire history and knowledge of that continent. That was really powerful. Did you have anything to add there, Aoife?
I mean, honestly, all you said there, Paloma, was poetry. But I think what really stood out to me was when you said, because through the power of memory, the land lives on, and we resist with the original people of this land. And I think that's beautiful.
It sure was. Now, without further ado, let's announce our next speaker, Orlee Lauren, who will be speaking about climate justice. Orlee Lauren, she, her, is a sophomore in high school and a strong advocate for social equality. She's involved in multiple climate justice and gender equality organizations. Her local work includes Our Climate, Green Era Massachusetts, and Boston Climate Strike. She also participates in international organizations such as Dream Equal and Girl Up. Orlee is especially excited to speak at COP26 because gender equality and climate change are two intersectional issues which she is very passionate about. During her speech, Orlee will describe how women are impacted by climate change and ways to create equality amidst the climate crisis. So let's turn our attention over to Orlee's speech now.
Hello, my name is Orlee Lauren. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm a 15-year-old climate justice and gender equity activist. I'd like to start by thanking all of the sponsors and organizers of COP26. We have 18 student staff and more than 200 volunteers who have worked very hard to put this all together, and it's worked out beautifully, so thank you. Imagine you're standing in front of a dry field. What would have been green is beige, and you wish it would rain already. You planted every seed by hand last spring, and you see no fruits from your labor. You got dirt under your nails for nothing. You ruined your favorite pair of pants for nothing. You hoped for rain, but what you got was dust and drought. I want you to imagine that this drought has made every day a battle. Literally. Violence has increased because people are running out of resources and they want to protect the ones that didn't evaporate the way their water did. This drought has killed livestock and left people starving. Families that used to have hundreds of livestock now only have 2. The lack of potable water has led to disease and death, sometimes at a young age. Now I want you to stop imagining, because you don't need to. In 2015, a county in Kenya called Turkana was experiencing a severe drought. The drought affected them in all of the ways that I just described. Women and girls in Turkana had the task of walking to fetch water for their families and livestock. As global temperatures increased, their water source evaporated and became smaller and less accessible. Women and girls were forced to walk longer distances to get to a smaller body of water. Often the water was extremely unsanitary, but they had no other options. Fetching water during the day not only prevents women from going to school, it also allows men to generate income for the family without communicating where that money is going. Men are more likely to have the resources to go into town, leaving women and children to deal with the drought. And in a scenario where families do stay together, they're often forced to stay in toxic and abusive relationships because their partners have resources like money to survive. The intersection of race and gender can also determine a woman's likelihood to survive an environmental disaster. For example, Hurricane Katrina damaged coastal cities like New Orleans. Before the hurricane hit, 1 out of every 3 people who lived in these areas hit hardest by the hurricane were African American and of low income. More than half of these low-income families of color were supported by single mothers. The intersection of race and gender put African American women at a disadvantage because they were responsible for seeking resources for their families, but that was statistically unlikely, as about 60% of poor African American families during that time didn't own a vehicle. Although we call these natural disasters, they are becoming less natural by the year. Even a small sea level rise due to climate change could pose a greater risk of tsunamis in coastal areas. Patriarchal constructs significantly impact the chances of women surviving these crises. For example, in 2004, a tsunami hit Sri Lanka, Indonesia, and India. An Oxfam report says that the ratio of surviving men to surviving women was 3-to-1, because women weren't taught how to swim, but rather they were taught to look out for their family. So when the tsunami hit, men had the chance to save themselves, while women had to look out for their relatives and were struggling to save them. The idea that a woman's role is to breed children and take care of them prevents women from achieving equality and gaining independence, especially during environmental disasters. Wangari Maathai, the founder of the Greenbelt movement, saw these injustices and decided to fight back. Like those women who were tasked with fetching water that was miles away, she was indigenous to Kenya. She spent her time responding to the needs of the rural women around her. She noticed that their streams were running dry, they had insecure food supply, and they had to walk farther to get wood and firewood for fencing. There was a drought, and Maathai was committed to helping. She noticed that the everyday struggles that she had witnessed were tied to insufficient government responses and a lack of motivation to help each other. Let's try to look at the climate crisis through Maathai's eyes. It's hard to focus on one issue related to the climate crisis because there are so many overlapping impacts. She says, "We are constantly being bombarded by problems that we face, and sometimes we can get completely overwhelmed." She tells the story of a hummingbird who sees the large forest that it lives in burn. All of the forest animals flee, but the hummingbird, even though it's tiny, wants to extinguish the fire. So it goes to the nearest stream and takes a drop of water in its beak and puts it into the fire. The forest animals watch, thinking that the hummingbird is ridiculous, when in reality, they can help too. Like hummingbirds, we all have the ability to help, but we are stronger as a group. Wangari Maathai teaches us that we should try our best to save what we have while we can, together, by organizing and speaking up against injustice. Droughts like the one I described in Kenya aren't just caused by global climate change, they are also caused by a lack of action against inequality. Climate change will exacerbate all of these social challenges and inequities and further deteriorate girls' and women's lives. In other words, climate change affects us all, but it impacts groups already vulnerable more immediately and adversely. To me, understanding that is the purpose of addressing climate justice and gender equity. We need to implement equitable climate policy that protects frontline communities. We also need to dismantle societal constructs that prevent women from being seen as equal. We can't have one without the other. For example, if the government provides all Kenyan residents with an easy access to water and education for everyone, but toxic societal norms say that women should still take care of their families, why would women go to school if the norm says not to? Conversely, if women are seen as equal, but the government doesn't grant them equal rights, how will they live as equal to their male counterparts? This should be an international effort. In the case of the Kenyan drought, other countries can contribute their share by limiting their emissions and sending help to build infrastructure that makes education, healthcare, and water more accessible. Did you know that women produce 60 to 80% of food in low-income countries, but often have less resources than the men in those same areas? These resources include land rights, training, tools, technology, capital, and credit. In Kenya, the government needs to provide women with the same resources that men have, because if people of all gender have access to the same resources, they will see a 20 to 30% increase in food production on the same land. The government needs to provide healthcare and education, among other things, so that people of all genders are equally prepared and educated on climate change. Our work is limited if we take action against climate change without supporting women and girls, specifically women and girls of color and women and girls who are living in poverty. When we see ourselves as small birds who are capable of trying their best to make their own impact, we realize that there are so many ways to implement equitable climate policy and deconstruct the patriarchy. One way that we as individuals can help is by contacting people who represent us in our government. I did this for the first time with a climate justice organization called Our Climate, which advocates for science-based and equitable climate policy. I am now a fellow for Our Climate, training other young advocates to join me in pressuring our legislators to add a gender perspective to their climate policy. You can call, email, or schedule a meeting with your government representative in order to ensure that your voice is heard. If talking to your government officials is not an option, I suggest joining or creating a nonprofit organization that will empower you to speak up. We live like the hummingbird that Maathai described, in a global forest. Our forest is in danger. Climate justice and gender equity are intersectional the way roots in a forest are. It is our role as a collective ecosystem to support each other. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Orlee, for that. I think the thing that stood out to me most, honestly, was when you said we also need to dismantle societal constructs that prevent women from being seen as equal. That, to me, I think it really rings true, especially. And honestly, with this oppression that we as women face from the patriarchy, and everyone actually, because it does affect everyone, that rang to me definitely. So what about you, Malaika?
Yeah, I agree. That was really special. I also really loved how she mentioned the hummingbirds and how, like hummingbirds, we all have the ability to help, but that we're stronger as a group. And I think that's really important to mention, that together, if we work as a collective society, we're so much stronger and can accomplish so much more.
Absolutely. So up next, we have Benjamin Astete, who again is speaking on the theme of climate justice. Benjamin is a climate activist from San Fernando, Chile, the co-founder of San Fernando's first socio-environmental organization, Climate Collab. The organization's mission is to promote collaborative climate action and interdisciplinary and intersectional climate education, aiming to empower Latinx youth and to continue to the implementation of the 2030 Agenda. He participates in the campaign #EscasoAhora as an ambassador of the Escaso Agreement, the first legally binding treaty about environmental human rights in Latin America and the Caribbean. He concentrates his experience in activism, his tiredness of political inefficiency, and his hopeful vision in a speech that addresses climate justice, human rights, and climate education from the perspective of youth.
Hi, I'm Astete, incipient Chilean climate justice activist, co-founder of the first social-environmental youth-led organization in my town, Climate Collab, and an ambassador of the Escazú Agreement, the first legally binding treaty about environmental human rights in Latin America and the Caribbean. I don't want to use this occasion to enunciate another cliché and alarmist climate speech addressing an ominous projection about cataclysms, mass extinctions, and extreme floods, which nevertheless are entirely accurate. Today, I want to contribute from a perspective of territory. I will talk to you about two events that have actually taking place near my town in Chile. Just two of many. Intoxicated lungs, extreme dizziness, nausea, loss of sensitivity, classes cancelled, remotion from home, long wait for medical treatment due to collapsed hospitals. That is the reality of thousands of children with their families in the locality of Quintero, Puchuncaví, in the Valparaíso region. The reason? Nearly a dozen factories and thermoelectric plants surrounding the locale have repeatedly been causing severe greenhouse gas emissions, toxic clouds, acid rains, petroleum leaks, and heavy metal releases for years, polluting and destroying their living territory. Still, the Chilean government fails to give a solution to this. Most children in Quintero simultaneously suffer the infringement of their fundamental right to an education, health and well-being, access to clean water, shelter, a healthy environment, participation, protection, and I could go on with the list. We need to understand that the climate crisis is a human rights crisis, or even more severe, an emergency. We need our states to protect our fundamental universal human rights, acknowledging and defending their interdependent and intertwined nature. It is strictly necessary for climate justice to be achieved that human rights are at the forefront of every country's national public policy. Macarena Valdez, an indigenous climate and human rights defender, led the fight for the protection of the Mapuche communities and territories, which were heavily threatened by the installation of a power station. She received death threats, and one day after, she was found dead, hanging in the rafters of their house. In the investigation of her death, they found a fragment of third-party DNA. Nevertheless, the case was concluded and framed as a suicide. Macarena found death defending life, and like her, many others around the world. Latin America and the Caribbean are the most dangerous zones to be a climate and human rights activist. According to Global Witness, on average, 4 environmental defenders are killed per week since the Paris Agreement was signed back in December 2015. In 2019, there were 212 murders of activists, of which 148 happened in Latin America and the Caribbean. We need our governments to guarantee that local communities, especially indigenous communities, participate in the decision-making processes over future industrial projects that can potentially threaten their territories, biodiversity, and lives. We need more rigorous and strict socio-environmental impact evaluation methods in new industrial projects. And most urgently, we need our states to provide protection and access to justice for environmental, human rights, and biodiversity defenders, a vulnerable group of victims of the climate crisis. We need to change our culture and our narrative. The narrative has been for so long that the climate crisis is a distant, apocalyptic event that awaits us. But the truth is that the consequences of climate change are happening now, and people are suffering them. The climate crisis is here already. The moment to act is actually now, but we need to act for today, not for a cataclysm happening in 2090. The manifestations of the climate crisis are already a reality for many people, and the vast majority belong to an indigenous community. We can't achieve climate justice without racial and ethnic justice. Underneath it all, we urgently need to revise one of the roots of climate justice: climate education. The environmental crisis will shape the world younger generations inherit. They deserve to know the truth, starting in the classroom. But in Latin America and many nations worldwide, climate deniers, authorities, and lawmakers are teaming up to keep climate science out of schools, leaving children and youth unprepared and unequipped to thrive in a world of increasing temperatures and rising seas. We can't let powerful interests deprive youth of the knowledge and skills they need to navigate a changing world and contribute to building a better, more sustainable future. Within that realm, we can't achieve climate justice without gender justice. Girls' education is decisive for a sustainable future. To improve climate resilience, an investigation from Brookings Institution shows that for every additional year of education given to girls, the nation's resilience to climate-related natural disasters increases by 3.2 points. For a green economy, approaching girls' education as a route for building the workforce of the future would allow girls to develop green skills to lead in jobs in the green area, which are predominantly ruled by men. The global community needs to address women's reproductive health from a perspective of gender justice and based on human rights through quality education programs for girls. An educated female gives birth to fewer and healthier children and enjoys better economic prosperity. Today, I don't want to mobilize you from fear or panic, but empathy. I also want to make visible the other side of the crisis, not often highlighted. Day by day, there are more of us fighting against climate injustice, and I'm incredibly gratified by that. Through collaboration, we are building a path to hope. It is a reality that every day there are more citizens, organizations, companies, and institutions uniting forces for climate action. Sustainable development is becoming day by day a more essential pillar in our conversations and in the decisions we are making. But sustainability is not equal to climate justice, and as sustainable development has its own agenda, we need to discuss the elaboration of a climate justice and environmental rights global agenda. That is why, with pure joy, I celebrate the opening of spaces for a global conversation like this one, which leads us to a consensus for collaborative, systematized action. If our current political leaders won't save the world, we will. I quote lawyer, activist, and philanthropist Mandela. To deny people their human rights is to challenge their very humanity. Again, we need to understand that the climate crisis is a human rights crisis. Climate justice is social justice, and social justice defines our humanity, dignity, and hope. Let's keep collaborating. Thank you.
Thank you, Benjamin. We really do appreciate that. It was so insightful. And yeah, passing on to you, Malaika.
Yeah, I agree. Definitely. Thank you so much for your speech, Benjamin. That was amazing. Now, moving on to our next speaker, it's my honor to introduce Elizabeth Ekstrand, who will be speaking about health and well-being. Elizabeth is a 17-year-old student at Chapel Hill, living in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, in the United States. She currently attends Middle College High School at Durham Technical Community College. She chairs her campus's chapter of NCPIRG, students, a nonprofit dedicated to various student issues, including sustainability. She's also a member of the Made in Durham Youth Network, which advocates for racial equity in schools. She's a firm believer in the intersectionality and the amplification of underrepresented voices. In her spare time, Elizabeth channels her emotions about climate change into various writing projects, which she will be discussing in her speech on mental health amid the crisis. So without further ado, let's watch Elizabeth's speech.
When disaster strikes, we tend to think in terms of numbers. For example, we say that over $7 billion in damage has been done by Hurricane Sally, or that the Dow has dropped by 500 points. And even on a smaller scale, a more human scale, we use numbers. We say, for example, that 4 buildings have been destroyed in a town from a wildfire, or that salaries were cut by 15%, and so on. We live in a world obsessed with numbers, yet we seem to ignore the most pressing numbers of our time. We have somewhere around 420 gigatons of CO2 left to emit in order to limit warming to the 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold. That means that only a few years after I graduate from university, in 2025, we may have already surpassed the 1.5 degrees Celsius mark and be climbing to 2 degrees Celsius of global warming, a level at which the damage done will be irreversible. No one seems to be listening to these numbers. So, to honor the scientists who worked tirelessly to come up with them, and to save millions of lives, we need to think beyond numbers. We need to emphasize the cost of the climate crisis to actual human lives and livelihoods. And that means talking about another crisis we are currently facing, that of mental health. When you ask the average American what unique crises millennials and Gen Z are facing that previous generations dealt with far less often, 2 answers tend to emerge: the mental health crisis and the climate crisis. Yet somehow, the 2 issues almost seem to be separated by an or, rather than an and. One gets the sense that the mental health epidemic, and all that initiated it, from social media to academic pressure to fierce competition, is a current problem, one that our generation will face only as teenagers. The climate crisis, in comparison, is usually painted as the problem of our mid to late adulthoods. Not yet bad enough to be a current issue, but one we will later realize, mainly through numbers, through things like tanking economies and fewer fish and destroyed property. I am here to say that this unspoken assessment is completely incorrect, because the mental health crisis is not going away. It will in fact be worsened by what is happening to our planet. And the climate crisis itself is already happening, sending tens of thousands into depression and despair. When I started to discover the urgency and the severity of global warming, I felt a negative shift in my own mental well-being. As a result, I searched the internet for any connection of climate change and mental health I could find, and came up mostly empty-handed. Mental health articles talked about college admissions, but not about climate. Climate articles talked about property damage, but not about mental health. A few wonderful bloggers had discussed eco-anxiety, and professional mental health associations are beginning to talk about it, but the talk remains in its infancy. Why, I wondered, was this topic so obscure? when I would have thought it an obvious concern. After a few months, the answer came to me. The culture of the global north has turned us away from this conversation. I live, and many of you live, in a capitalist society, one where success is personal and once again defined numerically. The focus is not on the collective, but on the self. What can I do to get ahead? How do I make money? Am I doing well? It follows that the way we discuss mental health is based around our economic system. Poor mental health, as the global north sees it, is often defined as a barrier to personal success in the economy. For example, if a teenager suffers from depression, that is concerning because their grades might drop, and they'll have trouble getting into college. If an adult has bipolar, that is a barrier they must resolve with their boss in order to keep their job. The cures, too, are centered on small, personal actions. I saw a meme the other day. In it, a fictional client was listing their struggles from inability to afford rent to an uninsured but life-saving surgery. The therapist responds, "This is all very normal. Have you tried meditation?" Don't get me wrong, self-care definitely has its place. But when faced with outright denials of basic human rights and a horrifying crisis of the powerful endangering the most affected people and areas, deep breaths alone are not the answer. As a result of this obsession with ourselves, instances of mental distress centered outside of oneself, in sympathy and empathy for others, are generally, in the global north, frowned upon with puzzlement. I experienced this shift firsthand. At the start of my high school years, my highest priority was maintaining good grades. When I expressed academic stress, I received all sorts of comfort, gifts, hugs, motivational high fives, and heartfelt notes. Then my primary source of distress shifted to the far larger obstacle of the climate crisis, and the reactions I received shifted right along with it. Those who had hugged me before now joked about my obsession with climate change. Those who had written notes of validation now told me that everything was going to be okay, and I didn't have a good reason to worry about the environment. And one by one, the people I trusted began to echo the same comments over and over again. What was the primary comment I heard? Well, our house isn't on fire. We're lucky to be where we are. We're safe. Now come have some pizza. I do not blame my friends and loved ones for responding this way, angry as I felt, because it is how they have been taught to respond, pressed to respond, in a culture that values profit over people, personal success at the expense of united communities. A culture that tells us that yes, marginalized people might matter, human livelihoods might matter, but not as much as the next thing on one's own to-do list. I think I speak for all the youth when I say we will not accept that message. Furthermore, we truly don't have a choice. If we continue to view empathy for our global neighbors, particularly the most affected people in areas, as foreign or suspicious, then our planet will keep on warming. Sure, we might install a few solar panels and drive more electric cars, but that is not climate justice. And we, here at COP26, demand climate justice. We must amplify the voices of the most affected people and areas. Their words, presented here today in my peers' speeches, are far more crucial to climate justice than any we in the global north could possibly contribute. We must also normalize collective emotional struggle. Humans are social animals, so to invalidate all mental health issues that arise from the state of the world, rather than one's direct position, is just as unnatural as it is harmful. If you are a mental health professional, I implore you to recognize that the usual solutions and techniques do not apply to the climate crisis. There must be innovation in the profession, innovation that includes validation and an acknowledgement of just how collective this crisis is. And, most importantly, we should acknowledge the need for activists to take breaks. People cannot raise their voices day in and day out with no rest. Self-care is not the cure for climate anxiety, but it is a necessary task. If you find it impossible to spend your free time burning fossil fuels, pretending the climate crisis doesn't exist, as it seems like society expects we do, then find ways to align your rest with your goals, just like you do with your action. Maybe that entails cutting your fossil fuel consumption, as NASA scientist Peter Kalmus has done and described in his book, Being the Change, which I highly recommend. Maybe that's reading All We Can Save, which is an antidote to climate doom, written by women at the forefront of the movement. Maybe that's writing climate fiction, as I do, pouring your emotions, hopes, and dreams into art so that more people join the movement. Individual action alone will not solve the crisis, but I've found it's a helpful way to avoid cognitive dissonance and fight for solutions on every level. Above all, if there is one thing I want you to take away from my words today, it's that if your mental health is declining along with the climate, that is not your fault. If you are not being validated in your struggle, especially, that is also not your fault. Individual shame and blame is a systemic problem. The more we fight against the polluters who have caused the climate crisis, the more we also fight a culture that leaves millions of people depressed and defeated. If we fight hard enough, if we put the most affected people in areas at the forefront of our fight, then perhaps we will no longer be known as the generation suffering from the mental health and climate crises, but as the one that overcame them. Until then, we raise awareness of the connection between the two crises. We take care of ourselves, and we take care of each other. And, most importantly, we get involved. We act now, because the climate crisis is here, now. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth. That was amazing and really powerful. I really liked how you touched on that individual shame and blame is a systemic problem, because I think that's a really important point to acknowledge. And also how you said that the more we fight against polluters who have caused this crisis, the more we're also fighting against a culture that leaves millions of people depressed and defeated and behind. Did you have anything to add to that, Aoife?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I really appreciate the fact that you brought up the most affected people in areas and that they should be at the forefront of our fight. And that really did stick with me, because absolutely right. You're absolutely right. So yeah, thank you so much, Elizabeth. So moving on to our next wonderful speaker, Reynier Tasico, who will be talking about climate education. So Reynier is an emerging youth leader in the Philippines that utilizes data towards social good through mapping initiatives with the Ministry of Mapping Collective and advocating ethical use of data with the Data Ethics PH. Now, as a climate reality leader, he advocates for climate action and the use of evidence-based policies in the Philippines that may help prevent further damages from natural hazards brought by climate change as a country that is prone to natural disasters. So without further ado, we'll hear Reynier's speech.
So, hello everyone, I'm Reynier Tasico from the Philippines, and I'm from the Ministry of Mapping, also part of the Young Southeast Asian Leaders Initiative Network and the Climate Reality Project here in the Philippines as well. So, as part of the Ministry of Mapping, I would like to share our initiative or something that I would like to share to all of you here on the mock COP26, which is the map today, map for tomorrow, and data saves lives. So before that, by the way, I'm from the Philippines, and though there's so much things happened here, this 2020 before the pandemic, aside from acting at any natural hazards. So what are they? And by the way, Philippines is the second most vulnerable up to date, the most vulnerable to climate change in the world. Yeah. So yeah. So what are the natural hazards? So these are things that are phenomenon happened here in the Philippines or around the globe. Though what we have faced here in the Philippines is that we faced Typhoon Haiyan last few years ago. Then right now the Molave and Goni, which images shows um, the lahar in Kinobatan, though some of these images came from the ABS-CBN. Next, so regarding the natural hazards, and this the images from also from internet and ABS-CBN as well. So child volcano eruption before the pandemic. And with that being said, the tropical cyclone density and tracks from 1884 to 28. So with that being said, the most vulnerable to climate change is the Philippines, makes it second around the globe. Credits to Brother Bernard Allen Racoma, or we call him BA. And next, okay, with this, achieving the audacious project of the humanitarian OpenStreetMap, mapping for the people in need, mapping for the people and mapping by the people, and we map for the future. So, by the way, I just made that tagline and sourced from the humanitarian OpenStreetMap team. So let's start mapping. So then, with this, the planned activities for, I hope, as part of the youth here in the COP26, that we plan to equip local communities across the country with basic mapping, contribution skills on the OpenStreetMap, participation on mapping activities hosted by the Ministry of Mapping with its collaborators for the communities, especially mapping the buildings, forests, roads, and further land use. So here, what we've done with the MapEx that we've mapped the sultans of Barongi's in Maguindanao from the Bangsamoro region in Mindanao. Yeah. So this we use a satellite imagery in the humanitarian OpenStreetMap and the tasking manager. Then next, with an objective that to equip the environmental advocates, especially the youth, the Sangguniang Kabataan or the Youth Council here in the Philippines, and the barangay officials for of the local government with basic mapping skills for the community using the Sendai framework to the vulnerable and hazard-prone areas in the Philippines. So, okay, so the Sendai framework is much more on connecting the healthcare facilities here in the country as well, though, which also we are doing in the MapEx projects that we are also mapping the HIV facilities towards an accessible and informative locations aside from MapEx and the mental health facilities. So that being said, going to the next slide. So with that, the equipment materials here in these activities or these initiatives, the reliable internet connection, laptop or computer, though it could be a cell phone. Also, it has an installed open source softwares as well. It would be good, and then satellite imagery from other open source organizations. So this is what we do also here in the organizations like MapBex or in the OpenStreetMap team. We map or we create also maps from the satellite imageries, the opposite. So that Delaware. So acknowledging this initiative by the um, Pacific Disaster Center, it's more on the Philippines, though as part of the Pacific Ring as well, the Philippines. Yeah. So this is a collaboration between the USE and Department of National Defense and the Pacific Disaster Center. Yeah, the Office of Civil Defense. Sorry, correction for that. Then harnessing the youth's potential on towards the disaster reduction and disaster reduction efforts and potential to responses as well. So like us, the map decks, we also map safe spaces, HIV facilities, and some unmapped areas in the country, such as Romblon in Bicol, right now in Goni. Then past few weeks in the one earlier from the Maguindanao in Mindanao of the Bangsamoro region. Then the Philippine HIV facilities and support group, which we are doing right now in the MapBex. Then also just earlier we made this one. We map or teach everyone to map as well in the humanitarian OpenStreetMap team, much more on land use. So basically we use the satellite imagery of the Maxar. Then if we can find anything or more on validation, then we use also the being aerial imagery aside from other cross-validation sources for the imageries used, such as news or other areas as well, such our collaborators, especially in the disaster risk officers or the LGUs. So moving on, this is the team of the mental health awareness, led by Andy Tabinas. By the way, the MapBex led by Miko Tamura. Then mental health awareness. What do they do is that they also map mental health facilities in the Philippines. Then next, another potential to tap as well as a youth here in we map as the youth map in Pampanga with organizations like the FEU Alabang Youth Mappers, UP Society of Geodetic Engineering Majors, or UPJO, which they map buildings and contributed in the OpenStreetMap communities. By the way, it's led by the humanitarian OpenStreetMap team, Philippines, and the Thinking Machines. Though in Pampanga, Faye Andal's team first handled it around 2013 before the humanitarian OpenStreetMap team did. So recently we mapped the last March for the Quezon City, and the OSM statistics from the contributions in the OpenStreetMap by the youth. rather participating by the youth as well, by us. So by the way, what makes the Philippines unique is that to other countries that we have the youth council, or what we call the Sangguniang Kabataan, which is led by uh, an SK chairman from the age range of the 18 years old to 24 years old towards youth growth and engagement. So what if we tap the youth or create youth councils as well in other countries such as yours, or more on policies for towards civic engagement as well, so or disaster risk reduction. Yeah. So next, so here we have the DILG, then the LGU is SK Federation, and so this is the DILG leading the LGUs. By the way, the DILG stands for the Department of Interior and Local Governance, and then LG stands for the local government units, then handles the SK federations, then for the SK chairmans, and then the SK chairmans handles the SKs of each barangay. So the LYD and LYDC is not really important here, but may subject to change in other countries. So moving on, here are the tools that I would like to share as well here in the Philippines, that we have the hazard theories gov.ph, the MapDex, and then the mentalhealthawareness.com, and the pwaphilippines.org, and the Bagong Pag-asa as well. So let's look for that as well. And here are my references. So before I end this presentation, I would like to thank my friends, Brian Gonzalez, and my colleagues from the Ministry of Mapping, especially in David Garcia and Pico Tamura. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Reynier, for that. We really do appreciate everything that you've spoke about there. And yeah, what about you, Malaika? What did you think?
Yeah, that was amazing. Thank you so much for sharing all of your insights into that. That was amazing. Now, let me introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker is Aishwarya Puttur, speaking about climate education. She's a 15-year-old Canadian climate justice activist who has organized various campaigns such as the Stop CID or Bill 1, as well as the Defend the Defenders Indigenous Rights campaign with FFF Digital. She also worked with several other organizations, including FFF Toronto, Climate Science, and Climate Strike Canada, among others. She founded the Eco Club at her school, in which organizes several sustainability projects every year in regards to the environment. At Mock COP26, she'll be talking about climate education, why it's so essential, why the current climate education, what it looks like currently, and how we can implement it more. So without further ado, let's turn our attention over to Aishwarya's speech.
How did you learn about climate change? How much did your school teach you? Maybe climate education isn't available to everyone in your country. Or maybe it wasn't ever compulsory, so you just never cared. Hopefully, by the end of my speech, these are the very topics that you will be left thinking about. Hello, my name is Aishwarya Puttur, and I am an Indian-Canadian youth climate activist. Before I continue, I think it's fair to give an introduction to what climate education is all about. In simple words, climate education is educating people about the current climate crisis we're facing. It helps us understand and address the impacts climate change has on the environment, people, wildlife, and economy. So the question here is, why do I need climate education? Why is it required? Everyone deserves the right to know about one of humanity's most disastrous crises. The climate crisis is upon us now, And we are facing the impacts, not just in some future world, but in this exact moment. If not now, when will we start teaching about climate change? Natural disasters across the world are occurring, caused by global warming, yet many people don't know why. The most recent ones were due to climate change. And the people impacted by those disasters need to know the cause in order to work towards a solution. Let's break it down to the core now. Education. Some may say school's a prison, while others may like it. At the end of the day, education is a tool for children to learn essential topics and skills that they will need in their life to make informed decisions as a citizen and as a human being. The climate crisis should be included in that too. We need to make sure that our generation and the next generation of children grow up being very aware of every decision that both they and the system makes and how these decisions affect the environment and its people. If we teach children about this crisis and spark hope within them that they can create change, then that change will truly happen. Our generation is unique and special because we're one of the first generations to face the impacts of climate change, yet one of the last to make a difference. That means that we have the power to create future leaders and change makers right in our hands. Those who will carve the path to a world which is run by renewable green energy, a world where everyone believes in science, a world in which not only is climate change tackled, but all of the intersectionalities of it. Racial, social, and gender problems. With climate education, people will start doing everyday activities in harmony with nature. They will question the government and come up with solutions, therefore becoming change makers. It empowers everyone, especially young people, to take action. Now, people may say, why don't we put all of that money, energy, and effort into actual climate action? Good point. Except climate education is a part of climate action. Spreading awareness is one of the first steps for any issue. When we address and educate people about huge issues like climate change, we open their minds to the climate crisis and climate action. Those thoughts are going to stay in their minds. They will bring something to the table, and that's exactly what we need. The more people we educate, the more people contribute. The fact, do you believe in climate change is a political question, is baffling. At this point, when we only have a few years left to take actual climate action before the climate crisis becomes even more irreversible, we cannot afford people debating about a crisis that decides the fate of our planet, people, and wildlife. For example, think about biology class, and when you learn about human anatomy, does anyone ever go, but is it really real? Like, do I actually have a heart that pumps blood? I mean, it seems bizarre to me. No one ever does that. If you do, you might want to hit the books again. Anyway, moral of the story, no one ever does that because we are taught from a very young age that we have a heart inside our body, pumps blood, voila. Climate change should be taught like any other subject because it is as important as them. If climate change is taught just like any other subject, everyone will then believe, understand, and implement. The world will not just believe in science, but understand it. We see evidence every day. We see the numbers increasing. It should not be a debate at this point. All right, let's now talk about the current climate education around the world. Climate change education, also known as CCE, is a privilege. There's no doubt about it. It shouldn't be one, but it is. The climate education a person receives really varies in many aspects. Where they live, their educational systems, their curriculums, teachers, government institutions, etc. But at the end of the day, climate education is still a privilege. Believe me when I say this. Most of the activists I know have learned more about climate change through articles, the internet, books, and other resources than through their schools. Now that says a lot. To have to learn at such a young age about humanity's 6th mass extinction from resources off the internet instead of your school because they just decided to just brush off some facts. Honestly, it's even more frightening. Learning from external resources is also a privilege which not everyone has. Not everyone has Wi-Fi or internet connections, or even a community to talk and educate each other about these issues, or maybe even a library. According to a study conducted by researchers from the Lakehead University in Canada, along with an organization called Learning for a Sustainable Future, only 51% of Canadians feel well informed about climate change, while 43% failed a climate knowledge test. The study overall found that 86% of Canadians felt that they do need more information about climate change, and that climate change is mostly taught through science-related subjects followed by the social sciences. For only 1 to 10 hours per semester, or get this, even per year. Those numbers are absolutely staggering. How much do you think a teacher can actually teach and cover in 1 to 10 hours? What about the fact that basically only half of the Canadians in Canada feel well informed about a crisis that is looming over all of us and will decide our fate? Of course, those statistics are specific to Canada, and every country has its own, which I cannot go listing, otherwise this speech would go on forever. However, they do reflect how our current climate education status is and how much it is needed. Some places have a chapter on climate change in their science or geography class. Others may include it when they're talking about the environment, and some don't even touch on the topic. Now, when it comes to the implementation of climate change education, there are many things that need to be considered. Climate change is not standardized, and that is the problem. Italy became the first country to make climate education compulsory back in 2019. We gotta start somewhere, and that's great, but let's implement this everywhere. It's not like we don't have the resources to implement resourceful and beneficial climate change education. We do, but our governments are not doing it. There are so many organizations, including grassroots groups out there, who have developed country-specific curriculums for climate change education that can be implemented. Even UNESCO developed a program called ESD, or Education for Sustainable Development. They work with various national governments to integrate climate education into their national curricula. Now, they have developed recommendations for policymakers on how to integrate CCE, climate change education, and ESD, Education for Sustainable Development, into a country's national curriculum. Those include policy development, governance, and resources, meaning there should be high-level support from the government and coordination from the government. Curriculum development, having CCE and ESD featured at all levels of the education system, capacity building for teachers and educational planners, and finally, public awareness, communication, and stakeholder involvement. Education for all is a human right, and education about a crisis that affects each and every one of us is also a right. Climate change education should no longer be a privilege, but rather something that is available to all. One that includes the intersectionalities of the climate crisis, states scientific facts as it is, has frontline defenders and marginalized people's voices heard, and explains how we can make sustainable changes and take action. Not just individual ones, but also systemic. All I ever learned at school was what global warming is, how it's caused, the greenhouse effect, and what we can do about it. Individual actions such as the 3 R's, reducing, reusing, and recycling, the regular. I know that sounds like everything climate related was covered, but in reality, there's a lot more to know. I completely acknowledge that I have privileges that allowed me to at least learn that much from my school, but that should not be the bare minimum. What about the existential threat climate change imposes on our world, its impacts, systemic involvement? Because we are never going to stop the climate crisis by just recycling alone. That's not going to happen. Climate justice, its intersectionalities, how it affects the marginalized communities the most, even though they contribute the least towards global emissions. There is so much more we can be doing to teach our children about the climate crisis, especially when the only CCE I did undergo was brushed over in a very brief science lesson. I learned how climate change is a crisis and its terrible impacts only through the internet, social media, by talking to people, and by attending webinars and conferences. I got involved with activism through fear. The fear that I soon won't be able to live in a world in which I can breathe in, a world my future generations will be swimming through due to the excessive sea level rise, a world with no more fauna or flora. As time went on, my fear became hope. As I saw all these other passionate activists and scientists who were willing to fight for our planet just like me. No person should have to go through fear like that, but almost every person who cares for the environment does. Thomas Isaac, a high school science teacher, decided to do an experiment one day on the group of students he was teaching. He took surveys before and after teaching about climate change throughout the entire year. His experiment showed that students felt less distressed about their future after going through climate change education because they finally understood it, even though they weren't exactly the most enthusiastic for the future, which honestly makes sense. I mean, it would be. But the results also proved that the students now felt a bigger call to action, which is exactly what we need. We need to educate people so they won't have to go through articles and learn on their own of the shocking details about our planet's present and future. We need to educate them in a way that will ignite their passion to take climate action. We need to educate them in a way that they will have hope for the future of our world. Finally, I'd like to conclude my speech by saying the world and its people deserve to know, understand, and implement climate action about a crisis that will seal humankind's fate forever. So y'all better start working. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you to the entire Mock COP team for hosting and giving us all this opportunity to further educate ourselves. Goodbye.
Thank you so much for that. We really loved hearing your words. I think the thing that stuck out to me most was when you said the world and its people deserve to know, understand, and implement action about crises that will seal humankind's fate forever. So you better get working, and we do love that message. Passing it to you, Malaika.
Amazing. Thank you, Aishwarya. That was such a powerful speech on the importance of climate education. I really did love it, and I loved your passion that shone through on that. I really liked in particular how you said that we need to educate them in a way that will ignite their passion to take action. And we need to educate them in a way that will give them hope for the future, but that will also inspire them to take action. And I also noted how you said that the problem is that climate education is not standardized. So I think that's really important for everyone to know that climate education needs to be standardized. So thank you so much for everything you had to share in that really powerful speech. Now, I'm moving on to you, Aoife. Would you like to introduce our next speakers?
Yeah, so next up we've got Emmanuel, Sáenz, Peńa, and Joselyn Rodriguez-Sanabria, who again will be talking about climate education. So Emmanuel is a project and communication strategist with experience in programs focused on sustainable development, human rights, and social responsibility in international organizations, non-governmental organizations, and public entities. His academic and professional experiences in international and intercultural context, and the Y4GG project coordinator. Joselyn is a professional in international relations with an emphasis on international politics, has experience in the developing of environmental projects, and an active member of Real Costa Rica Society since 2018. Experience in strategic management and communication, passion and vocation for human rights and sustainable development. Y4GG key role. So we'll hear their speech real soon.
Buenos días, buenas tardes o buenas noches. Para nosotros es un placer ser parte de este evento para motivar y seguir generando jóvenes agentes de cambio. Venimos en representación de la organización Rally Internacional, específicamente de la oficina de Rally Costa Rica, y somos parte del proyecto Youth for Green Road, el cual le decimos por sus siglas Y4GG. Antes de presentarnos formalmente, nos gustaría plantearles esta pregunta que dice: ¿somos las juventudes capaces de generar un impacto ambiental? Mientras van pensando en la respuesta, nos vamos a presentar. Mi nombre es Emmanuel Sáenz, soy de Costa Rica, soy estratega de proyectos y comunicación y actualmente soy el coordinador de Y4GG a nivel nacional. Hoy me acompaña parte de quien es parte del equipo de Y4GG, que es Joselyn Rodríguez, que le voy a dar el espacio para que se presente.
Hola, ¿cómo están? Mi nombre es Joselyn. Como mi coordinador les comentó, yo también formo parte de este programa llamado Y4GG. Llevo además 2 años contribuyendo con la organización como voluntaria en el área de comunicación. También realicé previamente una campaña de cambio de conducta y también soy miembro de la Junta Directiva de Rally Costa Rica. Bienvenidas, bienvenidos. Espero que esta presentación les sirva para empezar con sus proyectos o esas ideas que tienen en mente y que aún no han logrado despegar y que sean en pro de un crecimiento verde.
Muchísimas gracias, Joselyn. Bueno, espero que ya tengan como sus respuestas. Nuestra respuesta la vamos a dar al final de nuestra presentación, entonces para que se queden ahí atentos y atentas. Para explicarles un poco al respecto de qué es Rally Costa Rica y cómo está relacionado con el proyecto Y4GG, Rally Costa Rica es una organización que trabaja en el empoderamiento de las juventudes en pro del desarrollo sostenible. Es decir, generamos proyectos para que las juventudes sean quienes lideren acciones en pro del desarrollo sostenible. Específicamente, trabajamos en una de las áreas que tiene como nombre Juventudes en Sociedad Civil, y bajo esta perspectiva es que nace Y4GG, que es un movimiento global que se está desarrollando en 7 países distintos alrededor del mundo. Costa Rica es uno de estos países. Y específicamente lo que queremos con este movimiento es Juventudes en Acción, hacer que más personas jóvenes sean activistas y trabajen de la mano con personas tomadoras de decisiones. Específicamente en Costa Rica, lo que hemos venido haciendo es reclutamos un grupo de 25 personas jóvenes entre 18 y 35 años con el propósito de darles unas capacitaciones en diferentes temáticas como lo fueron teoría del cambio, intervención en cambio de comportamiento, comunicación ambiental, incidencia política, diseño, ejecución y evaluación de campañas. Todas estas capacitaciones hicieron que este grupo de personas ahora estén desarrollando su propio proyecto, el cual van a lanzar en el 2021 y el que Joselyn nos va a explicar con más detalle más adelante. Además, hicieron más de 60 horas de investigación y hasta el momento hemos trabajado más de 300 horas de planteamiento estratégico. Entonces, para entender un poco más todas las acciones y todo lo que esas capacitaciones han generado, le voy a dar el espacio a Joselyn para que nos explique.
yo les voy a hablar del estudio de caso de Y4GG Costa Rica y es acerca del empoderamiento de las juventudes para convertirse en agentes de cambio a través de formación de liderazgos. ¿Esto qué es lo que quiere decir? Que queremos crear un programa de formación de educación ambiental en el que capacitemos y empoderemos a los jóvenes para que se conviertan en líderes ambientales. Les voy a explicar un poco acerca de las etapas que nosotros consideramos son las más importantes en este proceso. Lo primero es identificar el problema. Como saben, como todo proceso investigativo, debemos empezar por definir cuál es el problema. Lo que nos llevó a realizar un estudio acerca de la participación de jóvenes en espacios de discusión, voluntariado, grupos cantonales, etc. Entonces, imagínense qué importante para nosotros, 25 jóvenes, investigar y entender la realidad que vivían otros jóvenes en distintos entornos y cómo conocer estos problemas para poder empoderar a otros jóvenes nosotros mismos, ¿verdad? Ahora, a partir de esta investigación lo que nos dimos cuenta es que allá afuera hay miles de iniciativas, miles de proyectos, de ideas que son sumamente innovadores, pero que debido a aspectos como el adultocentrismo, como la falta de oportunidades y falta de conocimientos y habilidades, no han podido llevarse a cabo. Entonces, ya una vez identificado este problema, procedimos a definir los objetivos. Nosotros sabíamos que queríamos crear un proyecto para empoderar a personas jóvenes y que estos trabajen activamente en pro del desarrollo sostenible. Pero ¿cómo podíamos hacer esto? Entonces, esta otra parte que es sumamente importante y que nos ayudó muchísimo fue la de las capacitaciones. ¿Por qué? Porque estas capacitaciones nos dieron los conocimientos, las herramientas, las habilidades que necesitábamos nosotros, un equipo multidisciplinario de distintas edades, para continuar en este proceso. Entonces, una vez definidos estos objetivos, pasamos a definir una estrategia, pero en el momento en que se dieron estas capacitaciones y en el que ya estábamos trabajando acerca de lo que ya queríamos hacer, se dio esta parte que para mí es muy importante, que es el proceso creativo. Es el momento en donde surge la idea, porque como les comenté, nosotros sabíamos que queríamos empoderar a jóvenes, pero no sabíamos ni cómo ni cuándo lo íbamos a hacer. Entonces es a partir de aquí donde surge la idea de crear un programa de capacitación. Entonces es donde se da la magia, en el proceso creativo se da la magia, se dan todas esas ideas, todas esas alternativas, todas esas propuestas para solucionar el problema que tenemos. Ahora, después que definimos pasamos por esta etapa, creamos una estrategia que es como una hoja de ruta que nos enseña hacia dónde tenemos que movernos. Y después procedemos a realizar la formulación, el desarrollo, la ejecución y la evaluación del proyecto para concluir con nuestro objetivo, que era crear un líder ambiental. Quiero detenerme un segundo para hablarles un poco de la estrategia. ¿Qué es una estrategia? Una estrategia es un plan para lograr un objetivo. Entonces, nosotros lo que hicimos fue plantearnos estas preguntas y que nos ayudaron muchísimo para continuar a lo largo del proceso. Entonces, lo primero que nos preguntamos fue, ¿dónde estamos? ¿Por qué estamos aquí? ¿Dónde podríamos estar? Fue la tercera pregunta. ¿Cómo podríamos llegar allí? ¿Cómo podríamos llegar a eso que queremos lograr? Y por último, si estamos en el camino correcto. Y esta última parte es la que nos estamos cuestionando constantemente para ir evolucionando, para ir modificando ciertos aspectos que necesitamos cambiar para hacer el proyecto más efectivo. Es muy importante siempre estar cuestionándonos qué es lo que estamos haciendo en este momento que nos ha funcionado y qué es lo que necesitamos cambiar para continuar. Ahora, una vez ya que definimos esta estrategia, creamos un objetivo que era alcanzar 3.000 buenas prácticas ambientales, incluidas compostaje, reducción de plástico, reciclaje, que promuevan estilos de vida más sostenibles para el 2020. Y todo esto por medio de una estrategia de comunicación. Entonces, nuestro plan es incrementar el conocimiento y concientización de 200 personas jóvenes costarricenses en buenas prácticas ambientales. Y esto, ustedes se preguntarán y dirán, bueno, son 200 jóvenes, pero ¿cómo van a lograr alcanzar esas 3.000 buenas prácticas? Entonces, a partir de ahí es que nosotros con el programa de formación de líderes queremos que estas acciones y este proyecto, por ejemplo, se repliquen y así crear un efecto en cadena que pueda generar 3.000 buenas prácticas ambientales y en el transcurso del tiempo que dura el proyecto. Ahora, este programa de formación tiene 2 etapas o 2 partes que trabajan de manera conjunta. Una de ellas es el programa de educación ambiental, que es toda esta plataforma que se va a crear de educación en el que se van a hablar de distintos temas divididos en módulos tales como biodiversidad ecológica, manejo de recursos, estilo de vida sostenible, liderazgo ambiental, que es un módulo sumamente importante también y es el que le va a dar las herramientas al joven para empoderarse y convertirse en un líder ambiental. Y de la mano de este programa de educación ambiental está la campaña de comunicación que tiene un público meta de personas entre los 18 y 35 años y que tiene el propósito de crear una comunidad de juventudes con estilos de vida más sostenibles y que se va a difundir en distintos canales como redes sociales y otras plataformas globales. Ahora, en síntesis de todo esto que les he estado comentando, una parte muy importante, investigación, conocer nuestra audiencia, conocer la realidad en la que vamos a trabajar, cuáles son las poblaciones en las que queremos realizar nuestro proyecto. La segunda parte, la parte del proceso creativo, que como les dije, se da en todas las etapas, pero es sumamente importante en el momento en donde surge la idea, donde surgen todas esas propuestas que queremos implementar para lograr nuestros objetivos. La tercera, estrategia, que es una hoja de ruta que nos dice a dónde estamos y hacia dónde queremos ir. Y por último, actuar. Entonces, bueno, yo los dejo con estos 4 puntos, estos 4 consejos y espero que les sirvan y les ayuden un poco a guiarse a cómo empezar a empoderarse y trabajar en pro del ambiente, en pro de un crecimiento verde.
Muchas gracias, Joselyn. Precisamente este es un resumen perfecto de cómo hemos venido desarrollando nuestro proyecto y el cómo hemos venido formando líderes por medio de la educación y las capacitaciones. Entonces, para ir concluyendo, nos gustaría retomar la pregunta que hicimos al inicio, que dice, ¿somos las juventudes capaces de generar un impacto ambiental? Creo que la respuesta es un sí absoluto. Sin embargo, nosotros a esa respuesta queremos agregarle que una forma de generar un impacto ambiental sería dándole a esas juventudes las herramientas. Y una de las mejores herramientas, o tal vez la más importante, es educación ambiental. Que sean personas jóvenes formadas, que tengan el conocimiento, que tengan las capacidades y que tengan todas esas herramientas que son necesarias para entonces empezar a generar y empezar a desarrollar iniciativas que tengan tanto impacto social como ambiental para crear un mundo más verde y justo. Precisamente nuestro proyecto Y4GG ha demostrado que las capacitaciones son esenciales para que se combinen con la actitud y la capacidad de las juventudes para entonces que ese crecimiento y ese impacto sea exponencial y, como dijo Jos anteriormente, despegar esas ideas y hacerlas realidad. Si bien este grupo de 25 personas va a hacer el lanzamiento en el 2021, entonces les invitamos a que si quieren saber más sobre el desarrollo de este programa de educación ambiental y de esta campaña en pro de buenas prácticas ambientales, les dejamos nuestros contactos para que nos escriban, incluso si necesitan apoyo en algunas de sus proyectos o acciones personales también, con muchísimo gusto podemos conversar, y si quieren incluso ser parte de Y4GG de alguna forma, totalmente invitados. También les dejamos nuestras redes sociales, donde vamos a estar publicando y divulgando el lanzamiento de nuestra campaña, porque las buenas prácticas ambientales, si bien están enfocadas para Costa Rica, son esenciales a nivel mundial y necesitamos más jóvenes con estilos de vida más sostenibles. Entonces, bienvenidos y bienvenidas a ser parte de Y4GG Costa Rica también. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias.
What a wonderful, wonderful speech from you guys. I think the phrase that really stuck out to me there was despegar esas ideas y hacerlas realidad. And for our English-speaking audience, it means to take those ideas off the ground and make them come true, which I'm sure you, Malaika, will agree with.
Absolutely. Now, I'm really excited to introduce Chloé Ludden, who will be speaking about the nationally determined contributions. She is a science candidate in environmental governance at the University of Freiburg in Germany. She is 25 years old and is fortunate enough to have studied in Paris, Istanbul, and Rome, and is now working in Berlin. She is fascinated by the interface between science and policy and determined to hold both policymakers and scientists accountable to preserve future generations. Now let's turn our attention over to Chloé's speech.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everyone. My name is Chloé. I'm a French and British citizen currently working in climate policy in Germany, and my contribution will focus on national carbon commitments.
As you may have heard, commitments to climate neutrality are burgeoning around the world. The government of China, one of the world's biggest emitters, has recently announced a carbon neutrality goal by 2060. Notice the difference. Carbon neutrality means that carbon dioxide emissions are offset by carbon sinks, such as forests, wetlands, or by other technological means that we are about to scrutinize together. Climate neutrality, on the other hand, means that all greenhouse gases are accounted for, not just carbon dioxide, but also methane, for instance, which stays for a much shorter period of time in our atmosphere, 20 years compared to 100 for CO2, but is 30 times more potent as a heat-trapping gas. Hence, since methane traps more heat than CO2, it makes sense to incorporate all greenhouse gases into our climate targets. So, let us first find out what climate neutrality really means. Climate neutrality refers to a state in which the activities of an individual or an organization, a city or a country result in net zero greenhouse gases emissions. Net zero emission means that all man-made greenhouse gas emissions must be removed from the atmosphere. You can think of it as a giant accountancy book. If I add emissions on one side, I ought to remove just as much emissions via natural or artificial sinks on the other side in order to maintain the Earth's net climate balance. Complicated, you say? Well, for now, policymakers have not found better than a giant balance sheet to organize carbon commitments around the world. So then, for human activities to be climate neutral, either the activities themselves are associated with zero emissions, just like you and me riding a bicycle, for example, or the greenhouse gases released by the activities must be offset by sequestering an equivalent amount of CO2 elsewhere. Currently, CO2 is the only greenhouse gas that can be sequestered from the atmosphere. I will take questions in a few minutes, but keep in mind the idea of a giant balance sheet. The emissions from one activity somewhere can be balanced out by CO2 sequestration elsewhere. This is called carbon offsetting and has been around for a long time. The problem we face today is that even if emissions from one activity are offset by reducing or avoiding emissions elsewhere, there is still a net release of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. This is where the Paris Agreement comes in. Climate negotiations before the Conference of the Parties in Paris in 2015 had been based, implicitly or explicitly, on the idea that global warming would depend on the total amount of greenhouse gas emitted into the atmosphere. Signing up for limiting the Earth's temperature rise would mean setting the specific total amount of emissions reduction required in order to reach a goal and the rate at which emissions should be cut. Major emitters, however, were not able or willing to promise cuts on the scale needed for respecting the widely accepted limit of a 2-degree temperature increase. Paris changed this deadlock in 2 ways. First, the agreement set up a ratcheting mechanism, meaning that policies to cut emissions would get more and more ambitious over time. In plain words, countries could sign up today while promising to be more ambitious tomorrow. The second, most subtle method is the possibilities for countries to resort to negative emissions. Yes, you heard me well. There is such a thing as producing something negative. Negative emissions take greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere, and they are officially needed in order to stabilize global warming at 1.2 degrees. So then, the stable level of greenhouse gas that is imagined for the second half of the 21st century is not achieved only by the absence of all human-related emissions, but also by the advent of technologies or policies that remove already emitted carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. If positive and negative emissions are in balance, the net zero emission world is created. Now I know this is a lot to take in, and I hope you will bear with me for the next minutes, because I will now get into the nitty-gritty of this net zero emissions world. Large-scale carbon dioxide removal, or CDR, also known as negative emissions, aim to address climate change by removing carbon dioxide permanently from the atmosphere. Now, trees also sequester carbon, of course, but only up to a certain point. Trees don't grow into the sky. As we are seeing around the world, forests are exposed to wildfires, savage harvesting, and they are vulnerable to changes in political regimes. Counting exclusively on forests to store carbon is unwise in the long run, since it might very well be impermanent. Other technologies are being considered to capture carbon and store it underground or under the ocean floor. If deployed at a planetary scale, CDR, or carbon dioxide removal, could help prevent ocean acidification and slow the rate of global warming. But these technologies also come with a great deal of uncertainties and pitfalls. For example, the amount of land required to deploy them at scale could threaten food security around the world, since a large part of arable land would then be dedicated to monocultures. These crops would fix carbon and be burned to create energy, only the carbon emitted would then be captured and stored under the Earth's surface. This technique is called bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, also known as BECCS, and is central to all policy scenarios, allowing us to reach 1.5 degrees in temperature rise. Large-scale deployment is expected to start as of 2030. This is where I want to draw your attention to. Carbon commitments are based on already technologies that ought to be deployed on a very large scale, which gives us little room for trial and error. If we are to avoid lock-in into inappropriate techniques, we need to scrutinize not just the targets, but the policies and research programs that support these goals. Listen to the science is an important message for policymakers, but science is never neutral. In fact, it is very political. Most countries researching these technologies at the moment are based in northern universities with little cooperation among northern and southern countries. So, some countries have already adopted the climate neutrality goal and even announced a target date for reaching this objective. While it is good news to announce ambition, how exactly are governments intending to reach the balance between their emissions and their removal is the questions we need to ask. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Chloe. And the thing, again, that really stuck out to me there was that it's not just about scrutinizing the targets, but the policies and research program that support those goals. Absolutely.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you on that one, Aoife. I also like how you said, Chloe, that listening to the science is an important message for policymakers, but that science is never neutral. And in fact, very political in most countries. So that's really important to think about, how listening to the science needs to be at the forefront of everything. So thank you so much for your speech. And now on to you, Aoife, to introduce our final speaker of the day.
For sure. So we have yet another Chloe, so Chloé Broom, who is an analyst at Carbon Intelligence, a London-based sustainability consultancy who aim to accelerate and drive the transition to a global net zero carbon economy. Since joining Carbon Intelligence, Chloé has gained a wealth of experience supporting businesses to set carbon reduction targets, alongside facilitating accurate reporting of greenhouse gas emissions and the transparent disclosure of the company's environmental impact to further drive change. Chloé's interest in sustainability began when studying geography at the University of Exeter, with a specific focus on the sustainability of human environment. It was here that she developed a passion to pursue a career in helping businesses in the wider economy to tackle climate change. So, moving on to her video. So yeah, thank you, Chloé.
Hi, I'm Chloé. I'm from Carbon Intelligence, and I'm going to talk to you today about the role of businesses in tackling climate change. So what we really hope you to get out of today is a good understanding of why businesses need to act. So this is why businesses as in particular, and also in the current climate scenario, why it's so important that we do act now. And then to really gain an insight into where the UK market is at the moment and how they got there. So what strategies are in place and what we do to work with businesses to get them to be ambitious with their climate targets. The latest climate science shows that we really must reach net zero if we want to avoid irreversible damage onto our climate. So current projections show that we're likely to see a 3.1 to 4.8 degrees of warming by 2100. However, global scientific consensus highlights that we can't go over 2 degrees if we want to avoid irreversible change to the environment. This is really where the Paris Agreement comes in. So it was governments committing to keep warming well below 2 degrees, but preferably be ambitious and get that to 1.5 degrees. However, the current policies in place are only going to get us to a warming of 3.1 degrees, which is much higher than where we need to be. And this is really where businesses come into play and why they are such key actors in the climate change crisis. Climate change has gained a lot of momentum over the past couple of years. It really started with Greta and the school strikes back in 2018, which was closely followed by the IPCC special report on 1.5. Another key milestone more recently was the UK committing to becoming net zero by 2050. I think this is really important because climate change, it was a really big year for climate change in 2020. The COP26 conference was supposed to take place. However, due to COVID-19, this had to be postponed. But it's really key here to understand it's not an opportunity for us to lose momentum. Climate change isn't going away. So it's really important for us to have our voices heard and ensure that climate change stays high up on the agenda. Why do businesses need to act? So I already mentioned their role with government policy. Government policy is not going to get us to reach our climate goals, so businesses really can. And there's not as much red tape for businesses, so they can be much more ambitious with their targets, which is much more challenging for governments to do. In addition, a large proportion of the environmental issues we face today are because of the way businesses operate. So they're really significant actors and big carbon hotspots as to why we are in this situation we are today. For example, the built environment is responsible for 40% of the UK's emissions. So this is looking at the buildings and the transport systems, many of which were built to ensure that businesses can operate effectively in the first place. So they're really key actors because they can bring down our emissions as they are such significant carbon hotspots. As well as this, businesses are incredibly powerful. They have tremendous power over their own operations and have the ability to instigate behaviour change with their suppliers and their customers. So they can decarbonise their own operations whilst also engaging with suppliers and customers to start looking at environmental strategies so they can set their own SBTs and really create this domino effect to ensure that this climate strategy doesn't just stop still. It kind of keeps going with the more businesses that they interact with. As well as this, businesses need to stay competitive. It's a slightly different spin and really shows how businesses need to develop these climate strategies and engage with climate change if they are to stay where they are. So the CDP, which was previously known as the Carbon Disclosure Project, which is a sustainability disclosure questionnaire, highlighted that in 2020, over 500 investors were asking thousands of companies to disclose on their environmental data. If companies don't show their sustainability commitments throughout their supply chain, where this is in terms of the buildings they rent, the products they use, etc., they will really fall behind. So it's really important for them, if they are to stay competitive, to engage with climate science. How are businesses responding? What are they doing at the moment? So these are just a handful of the businesses who over the past year have publicly announced what they are doing to fight climate change. So if we start with Brewdog, so they committed and they publicly announced earlier this year that they are now carbon negative. So they've done this by ensuring that all of their bars and breweries are wind powered, and they've also purchased a 2,000 acre bit of land in Scotland, which they're going to build a forest in and also build a peatland. So this will act as a carbon capture for any emissions that they are emitting into the atmosphere. Secondly, we have the sportswear brands, so we have Adidas and Nike, and they've really looked into developing sportswear and sports shoes that look at using upcycled marine plastic and waste before it goes into landfill. So the Adidas range, the Parley range, has actually prevented almost 3,000 tons of waste from going into the oceans just through the development of their range. I think the biggest one to note here, and the most significant, is Microsoft. So earlier this year, they pledged to be carbon negative by 2030. But in addition to this, they also announced that they would remove all the carbon that the company has ever emitted since they were founded in 1975 by 2050. I think this is really important because although more and more companies are engaging with setting targets, they are looking into the future and how to reduce future emissions. There aren't many companies yet that have looked at historic emissions and how they can start to remove those. So hopefully Microsoft will stand in an example and businesses will start to copy them with their climate ambitions. So how are these businesses actually setting these climate scenarios and meeting these targets? So we work with businesses to help align them to the Paris Agreement through setting net zero strategies and science-based targets. So what is net zero? It's a word that's thrown around very often. The UK have committed to it by 2050, but what does it actually mean? So it looks at reducing company-wide and value chain emissions in line with climate science, whilst balancing off any remaining emissions by enhancing carbon sinks, which removes CO2 from the atmosphere. So this is kind of the offsetting once these value chain emissions have been reduced. So value chain emissions, in addition to looking at what we refer to as scope 1 and 2 emissions, so the direct emissions of an organisation, whether that be the fuel they burn or the electricity, it's also looking at their entire value chain, which looks at their supply chain and their customers. So this can be anything from emissions associated with the goods they purchase to their business travel, their employee commuting, but can also go down as far as the use of sold products, which I will come on to later on. So this is what a credible net zero strategy looks like. So it really starts with that reduction pathway. So we do this by calculating a business's emissions, look at where those carbon hotspots are, and then look at the opportunities that are available to reduce these emissions and keep that reduction in line with climate science. We then look at the removals pathway, which is in pink, and this looks to invest in projects that remove the remaining emissions so that that company can have net zero GHG emissions. One thing to note here is that there are always target dates, but for the removals pathway, the target date must keep going, otherwise those emissions will keep going up. So what are science-based targets? So to get that reductions pathway as an official science-based target, it must be approved by the Science Based Target Initiative. In order to do this, there's a few criteria that the target must meet. So one of those is that the reduction pathway must be in line with climate science. So that's looking at it reaching well below 2 degrees, or ambitiously, we really push clients to try and get to that 1.5 degree pathway. In addition, the scope 3 emissions, if they make up more than 40% of the company's overall emissions, then they must be included in the target. So those scope 3 emissions are what I spoke about earlier. They're really wide ranging. So a lot of the time they do make up at least 80% of the overall emissions. So unless the company's in the manufacturing sector where scope 1 and 2 is really high, it's very likely that scope 3 needs to be included in their targets. So science-based targets really are one of the strongest and most credible ways a company can demonstrate their commitment to tackling climate change. This is really because it provides companies with a clearly defined pathway of by how much and how quickly they need to reduce their emissions. So these are just a few of the clients we've worked with over the past few years to set science-based targets and get those approved by the Science Based Target Initiative. So on the left here, we have their targets. And then on the right here, we have, if they were to meet those targets, how much equivalent carbon that is in real terms. And I think this is really key because it really shows just how powerful and how material companies are and why they are such key actors if we are to tackle climate change effectively. So when we're talking about scope 1 and 2 here, and then all these companies reducing it by 100%, they do this by procuring renewable energy supplies, whether that be natural gas or electricity for their sites, in order to meet their target. And then scope 3 is really where it gets more interesting. So if we take Nando's and reducing their footprint of a Nando's meal, they did this by, they did 3 things. So they looked to increase their plant-based options on their menus. They looked into investing in sustainable chicken production. And the third option, which we work with many clients to do, is to engage with their suppliers. So they engage with their suppliers to set their own science-based targets, which in turn would bring down their suppliers' emissions, which would then bring down Nando's scope 3 emissions associated with those suppliers. The other interesting one here is Puttur. So when we calculated Puttur's value chain emissions, we actually found that a lot of their emissions fell within their use of sold products, so in their value chain scope 3. And this is really because Puttur sells tea, and when they found that customers were boiling their kettles, that's where most of the emissions were coming from. And because they were boiling their kettles to drink their tea, it was falling into Puttur's scope 3 emissions. So this is a really difficult one to try and control because they can't tell people how often to boil their kettles, etc. But in order to kind of bring down these emissions effectively, they have started to join groups who are decarbonising the grid in order to bring down the emissions that are associated with the electricity that will be used when those kettles are boiled. Just to really finish off and bring it back to us, so we are Carbon Intelligence. We are a sustainability consultancy based in central London. We are a team of around 80 people who work across 60 countries. We're a team of data scientists, technologists, engineers and strategists. And I think what's really important to note here is we didn't all do environmental science or geography degrees at university. We did a range of degrees, so from history, maths, English, physics. And what's really brought us all together and why we work so effectively is because we all have the same passion for climate change. So it doesn't matter if that's not the degree you studied at university or that's not the career you started off in. As long as you have that interest, that's really all that is important. So our goal as a business is to help businesses to be ambitious and achieve their targets right across the world to instigate impactful change. Becoming a net zero business requires a coordinated approach that engages and raises ambition at every level. So our methodology is underpinned by the 6 dimensions of carbon intelligence, which we created in partnership with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. And you can see that on the right of the screen. So this framework really focuses on 6 key elements necessary to deliver ambitious targets. And these dimensions really allow us to tailor a bespoke vision of success for clients based on their needs and their budget. And it really provides scope for growth to stretch their ambition and maintain that long-term momentum. So these are just a handful of the clients we've worked with, and we work across a number of sectors, including commercial real estate, food and hospitality, and professional services. So thank you very much for listening. Please send in any questions you may have to the mock COP team, and one of the Carbon Intelligence team will be on the panel at the end of November and will be answer any that you may have.
Thank you so much, Chloe, and thank you so much to our audience for watching. It's been wonderful to hear all these fantastic speeches.
Yeah, I agree. It's been such an amazing lineup of speakers today. We couldn't have had a more diverse and amazing range of people to present to us on our 5 themes. So exciting listening to them all of today's speakers as well as yesterday's. So just a quick reminder, if you enjoyed these speakers and you have questions for them, please go check out the Pigeonhole on Mock COP's Pigeonhole and submit all of your questions for them so that they can get answered in their panel discussion.
And remember, don't forget to watch tomorrow's panel discussion with yesterday's speaker. And yeah, remember to tune in.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Yeah, it was wonderful to have this entire experience. So yeah, thank you all.